Good morning. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Yerushalmi Maisres Pedig Dalid Halacha Aleph. We're learning today Daf Lamed Gimel, and we left off on Daf Lamed Gimel Amud Aleph by the dot, 6 lines from the top of the Amud, which is almost halfway into the Amud. We have learned that if produce undergoes Gemar Melachim while owned by Hegdish, it will never become subject to Maisres even after it's redeemed. Our Gemara today will begin by asking 4 inquiries that have under all 4 of them the following premise. That in a case where the Gemar Malacha happened, let's say prior to someone consecrating it, Gemar Malacha did not happen in a way where it exempted it from. But after the Gemar Malacha, just as in my example, person took that item and he was Magdish it. And while it belonged to Hegdish, while it wasn't the domain of Hegdish, one of the Shisha Devarim happened to it. Now, there is a logic to say that just like we said, that if it's Gemar Melachet, Biyad Hegdish, it will never become obligated B'chlal in Maisris. Here, there's a logic to say that since the Kvius happened while it belonged to Hegdish, and obviously that Kvius is ineffective because it belonged to Hegdish, even if someone redeemed it and they did another of the 6, it will still not affect a kvius because it's already exempted from kvius. Now, by the way, that would not mean that someone can consume it in a way of keva, but that would mean that forever one will be allowed to have a achilas aray on that item. You got that concept? Yakir. It's kavaldik. That Nochamal, Gemar Malacha happened biyad Hedyet. After the Gemar Malacha, someone was Magdish it. While it was biyad Hegdish, the Gizber did one of the 6 things. That obviously will not be koiveya it because it's in the hands of Hegdish. Then someone redeemed it. So the Gemara has 2 sides. Maybe, not for sure. Maybe since there was an act of kavius while it belonged to Hegdish, and then it was completely ineffective. For example, someone put it on fire, won't have any effect because it belongs to Hegdish. So since by this produce, we already established that cooking it doesn't do anything, now that it's redeemed, even if someone again will cook it, it still will not be koiveya it or not. Again, it's a 4-step inquiry. So there are some cases and there are other cases. There's going to be another premise to part of the inquiries. And that is that when someone does a Gemar Malacha, they can do another step which will reveal and undo the initial Gemar Malacha. Just as an example, right, by grapes, right? What was the Gemar Malacha by grapes? Or by anything that you gather, by grapes. You put it in a basket, just as an example. So let's say a person did Gemar Malacha, but then they decided to make it into raisins. Not they only decided, they lay it out on the roof in order for it to dry out. Their action of putting it out to dry, which demonstrated that it's not finished yet, it actually undoes the Gemar Malacha that happened before. I'm giving that piece of information because we never talked about it, and that will be a premise for another part of some of these 4 inquiries.
Wait, what if you put the grapes in the basket, but you always have the intention to dry it out?
Then for sure there's no Gemar Malacha. Okay, that's not even a chiddush. Here we're saying there was a Gemar Malacha, but it can be undone through doing an act that demonstrates that you still want to do new things to it before you're going to eat it. Another important rule based on which we'll understand some of the sugyas that we'll learn today, that even when something did not have a Gemar Malacha, even prior to the Gemar Malacha, one is not to have that food in a way of keva. A su'udas keva may not be done to produce that was not tithed, not only after the Gemar Malacha, before the Echad Mishisha Devarim. The prohibition of eating something in a way of achilas keva is even when there isn't a Gemar Malacha. This is just a statement. I know we learned this in the Rambam. Maybe we even mentioned this before, but that will be another. I'm just sharing not the actual topic, but certain rules based on which we'll appreciate the topics today. And by the way, the same thing goes to wine. wine gets a gemar malacha when you skim. And then if you're not planning to merchandise it, then it needs echad meshisho devarim. And again, even prior to the gemar malacha, even prior to skimming it, one is not allowed to formally consume wine because of what I'm saying right now. Because even before gemar malacha, chilas keva, you can't have. Now again, from today's sugya, we're going to have even more clarity of what is the definition of a chilas keva and a chilas aray. And as we see, there isn't one criteria. It isn't only about the quantity. We're going to see certain details which will demonstrate that, for example, pouring wine in a cup and drinking it from a cup defines that drinking as achilas keva, even if you're only having a cup. It's not about the quantity, it's about the way you're consuming it. Okay, this is not a direct kitzur of today, but these are important nekudas that we have to know to understand today's daf. Today's daf is awesome. Daf lamed gimel lamed aleph, 6 lines from the top. As I mentioned, we're going to have 4 inquiries. The first one I mentioned clearly in the words of intro. So here, I just want to say what happens before the Gemara's inquiry. You had produce, and it had gemar malacha. And the gemar malacha now you cannot, right? If you would sell it in the market, you can't even snack from it. But you weren't planning to do that. You're planning to take it home. Midai Raisa, when is it nitbal ri'as penei bayis? Midrabanan, we just learned yesterday inside the Gemara, echad mishisho devarim. One of the 6 would be, the Mishnah says, about shalakoi, shalika, which is a certain type of cooking, of slight cooking. Items that are cooked that way, that's one of the shisho devarim. Here, what happened was that after the gemar malacha, the owner consecrated the item to the Beis Hamikdash, to the Berek HaBayis. While it belonged to the Berek HaBayis, shalakoi b'reshus hegdish, it was cooked. This undercooked, this slight cooking, and you have to know on your own. That act won't have any effect. Why not, Aviv? Because it belonged to hegdish. Just like we learned before that gemar malacha b'yad hegdish doesn't do anything. Not only that, it will never be chayiv to be tithed at all, even when it's redeemed. Here, it was cooked b'yad hegdish. That action for sure was not koiveya it, but maybe it did something even more. Now, now that you redeemed it, and the owner, the hedyot who redeemed it, did another of the shisha devarim. The example the Gemara gives, v'hichnisoi lachatzar beishmira, re'iyas penei bayis. In extension, L'Reish Lakish or Rabbi Yochanan midrabanan, you brought it into a chatzar that's dumei the bayis. According to the Tana Rabbi Yishmael, a Beis Shemira. So now the question is mahu. Mahu means, look inside the Pnei Moshe, 11 lines from the top of the Amid, in the middle of the narrow lines. Do we say that since it was undercooked, while it belonged to Hegdish, that should be like the Gemar Malacha that happens if it belongs to Hegdish during the Gemar Malacha? And then the rule is by Gemar Malacha that if Gemar Malacha happened the Yad Hegdish, even if it's redeemed later, it will never be Chayiv in Meiser. And the same thing would be over here. That since you cooked it while it belonged to Hegdish, even though you redeemed it, and now you did another of the Shisha Devarim. Which other one? As an example, I'm saying this because we'll see other examples soon. You brought it into your chatzar, you brought it into your courtyard. That also won't be effective. Amazing. Or do we say that that's the last line in the narrow lines and the first line under the Gemara and the Pnei Moshe, that cooking it b'reshus hegdish doesn't do anything. You're right. It's not going to be koiveya it, but it's as if nothing happened. And if it's as if nothing happened, Aviv, okay. So now if someone redeemed it, now they did another of the Shisha Devarim, so now that will be koiveya it. You get that? This is a real lumdisha question. Is the Shlika B'Yad Hegdish so powerful that it will forever exempt this from becoming established? Now, that doesn't mean that you can have Achilas Keva, because it had a Gemar Malacha when it did not belong to Hegdish. But what it will mean is that forever you are allowed to snack from it, even before tithing it, or not. And now the Gemara comes back again to the Machlekes Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan. How do we view the bringing it into Chatzar Beis Hashmira? According to Reish Lakish, this is an extension of The iyas penei bais, and that's significant. Al dated Rab Shimon ben Lakish, the Gemara says nitbal. No matter how you look at the first inquiry, it will affect a established a tevel vadai status. You will not be able to snack from it. You know why? Because what did you do when it belonged to hegdish? You cooked it. Cooking it is not a biblical action that is koiveya it lamaisers. It's a rabbinic action. So it can be that something that only would have been koiveya it had it not belonged to hegdish midrabanan, that cannot be powerful enough to even undo a later action that is koiveya it midoiraisa. Zu toira v'zu ena toira. So that's great. What the Gemara is really saying that according to Rabbi Yechanan, we don't know. The inquiry is not resolved. We are only saying that according to Reish Lakish, in this specific case, I can tell you that it will become a nitbal lemaisres when you take it into the chatzar beis hashmira, because now you did an action that's koveya it midoiraisa. Inquiry number 2. What happens if first, when it belonged to hegdish, again, items, hediet, gemar melacha biyad hediet, because if the gemar melacha happened biyad hegdish, there's nothing to talk about. Then you can even have achilas keva. It's patan mimaisres. No, had gemar melacha. Then you were magdish it. When you were magdish it, the gizbet brought it into chatzar beis shmira, which for sure does nothing. In other words, there's no question that when the one of the shisha devarim happens, biyat hegdish, it's ineffective. The question is, how much effect will that have? And now, pedoya, you redeemed it. And now you did a rabbinic shisha devarim. Coming back to the cooking, to the undercooking. Ushalakai. Now the question is, mahu. No, it's even according, let's go, according to Reish Lakish, even according to Reish Lakish, the Pnei Moshe writes 9 lines under the Gemara in the middle of the medium-sized lines, beginning of the line, Pidoi Ushalakoi Mahu, the Kosalka Daitach, the Hashta, Liba de Reish Lakish. Hakavi Ushal Chatzid, as we just mentioned, is Minat Torah. And that happened, Vihi Hoysaba Oide Bereshus Hegdish. And maybe now, Poiteres Mimaise Lafishu Iker. That for sure exempted it. There's no kiviyus. Tahava, it's just like a bona fide gemar melacha b'yad gizber, which has such a powerful effect that if the gemar melacha happens b'yad hegdish, even after you redeem it, it always remains exempt. And therefore, ve'ein hashlika shela achar sheyatza min reshusa hegdish will have any effect. Okay?
All right, can you have 2 gemar melachas? One, and then it changed?
There's no 2 gemar melachas, unless you undid the first one, which we'll get to soon. But you have 2 of the shisha devarim. You have different types of the shisha devarim. That's why it's more shaykh to ask this question here. So you would think that according to the Shlakish, based on what we said, that's what the Pnei Moshe says, it's a mahu, but almost for sure, that it will never become nitbal. Says the Gemara, no, I disagree with you. Adarabah, even according to the Shlakish, yes, nitbal. Why? This is amazing. I know that we kept on saying that from the Shisha Devarim, which one is the most potent one? Re'iyas Penei Bayis. Okay, because that's Midoiraisa. And according to Reish Lakish, right, taking it into Chatzar Beis HaShmira is also Doiraisa. Beautiful. Let me tell you a whole nother way of looking at the Shisha Devarim. Some of the Shisha Devarim is something that you do to the item itself, like you cook it, right? You cook it. Some of the Shisha Devarim, you're not doing anything to it. You're just changing its location. You're not doing a maise beguf of the produce, like re'iyas penei bayis, like to be machnesit lechatzar beis shmira, lechuura like Shabbos. All right. Which one do you think is more effective? There's a logic to say that an action, an event that actually changes the produce is more effective. So therefore, the Gemara says that even if when it belonged to Hegdish, you brought it into Chatzar Beis Shmira, after you redeemed it, you only did something that's a rabbinic. You cooked it. Still, the Gemara says, even according to Reish Lakish, that action of cooking it will be koiveya it lamaisres. Why? Because what action did you do to the item itself by bringing it lachatzar beis shmira while it belonged to hegdish? Nothing. Didn't do a maisa beguf of the produce. So therefore, to say that that should be so effective that even after you redeemed it, it will prevent any other of the Shisha Devarim of establishing a Kvius. That does not make sense. It's Mamash al Derech. The Rishonim speak about that Hoitzah as a Malachi Gerua. I think Tosfos writes that. We mentioned this not that long ago. And why is it that the Rabbeinu HaKadosh spends, I don't know, how many chapters in the beginning of Masechta Shabbos all speaks about carrying? And ironically, in the Mishnah, in Perek Shvi and Ayin Gimel and Bavli, when the Mishnah enumerates the Lamates Malachas, Hoitzah is at the end. So Rebbe doesn't follow his own Seder of the Lamates Malachas. So the answer is because since carrying is such a weak Malacha, you would think that it's not an issue. Rebbe speaks about it and speaks about it and speaks about it. I can even compound it. It's so common that in the big cities today, you have an Eruv. Many people forget about the whole prohibition of carrying. So you have to talk about it. To remember, there's an Isur Doirais of carrying. But why is it called a Malachi Gerua? Exactly for the same reason. All of the Lamed Ches of the Lamed Tes Malachas actually affect a change in the item. You're changing it. You're baking it. You're writing it. You're building it. Sewing it. Carrying it, you're not changing it. Beautiful. Okay, so now let's go further. Inquiry number 3. What happens if you are magdishit and ushulakai, higdishoy ushulakai? We began with this inquiry. And now it's going to get real fun. And after you cooked it, before you redeemed it, you did another of the Shisha Devarim. Which one did you do? Hichnise lechatzar beishmira. Now you did 2 things, guys. You did a biblical, but that doesn't change it. You did a rabbinic that changes it. And now you redeemed it. And now you did one of the Shisha Devarim, Ushulakai. So here the question is, Mahu, what do you say over here? How great is this? Look inside, let's go with a Marafulda. Marafulda around 4 lines from the bottom of the Amid. So you got what happened over here. That here, when it was Mugdash, you did 2 things.
Why didn't the second one change it? The first one changed it. The second one did not. I'm sorry. I did not follow.
Cooking it changes the item itself. Don't forget, Kevin, that what you do while it belongs to Hegdish, Vadai will not be Koiveya it.
Right.
All of these 4 inquiries are asking maybe, not only is it not going to be Koiveya it, but it will never allow for this to become established at all, even after you redeem it. So here you did Sai did the Oiraisa of taking it into a home. Sai you did the rabbinic, but that changes it. Look inside the Mara folder. Koidem apidia. Shaloi nitbu az afilo le Rabbi Yechanan. Why is that? Hoyel veichniso lechatzar ba'oidem b'reshus hegdish golui adate. Shaloi titpol alidei shalika ela adei chatzar. The Mara folder is adding another nuance, and that is that what you do, the last undoes what you did before it. Because when you cooked it, normally cooking it will make, now it's mamish, you are machshav it. The fact that this person, after cooking it, took it home, that is megala das, that the cooking it in itself, in the mind of the owner, is not the final thing that he's doing, he's actually going to be taking it home. So maybe we can view the taking it home as undoing the cooking. And we just mentioned that taking something into your chutzner doesn't change the chefza. And since it doesn't change the chefza, so therefore when you redeem it and now you cook it, the cooking it should be kreveya it, or not. Or not. At the end of the day, when it belonged to Hegdish, you also cooked it. And here again the Gemara says, I'll tell you, Divrei Hakol, yes, nitbal. This is amazing. Because we say that the hichnisoy lechatzar beis hashmira, after you cooked it, undoes the cooking it. Then the only thing that happened biyat hegdish was you took it home. Taking it home doesn't change the item. It's a weak shisha devarim, even though it's biblical, even according to Reish Lakish. And therefore, when you redeem it and now you cook it, yes, nitbal. And the final Chaver Daf Lamed Gimel Lamed Beis, this is great. The 4th inquiry would be, you had produce. Gemar Melacha biyad hediyit. Always. You're magdishit. When you were magdishit, you cooked it. Let's go back to the cooking it. You did something ma'aseh begufay. Then you redeemed it. And now after you redeemed it, vitzimkoi, you put it out to dry. Now, like we mentioned in the words of introduction, that it's amazing. You cook the grapes now. You cook the grapes. When you put it out to dry, that shows that what? That for you, it's not even an item that had gemar melacha. Okay.
So we're viewing it as the cooking was just part of the drying process or whatever process.
We're saying, oh no, well, so this is really subject to a machlokes. Don't forget, guys, we mentioned this to mention it again. Even though the Rambam paskins, and we began last chapter based on one side, and that is that the Shisha Devarim, any one of the Shisha Devarim, is only effective after the Gemar Melacha. But this statement is not true according to everyone. Let's speak about the cooking. Will the act of cooking establish that item, lemaisris? Establishing means that you can't even snack from it. Even if the item does not have a gemar malacha, or is eish, even though the Mishnah doesn't say the word eish, the Mishnah says shalika, will it establish it only if it has gemar malacha, or even if it doesn't have gemar malacha? One thing is clear from all of these inquiries. The Gemara is telling us that if you cooked it, biyad hegdish, since cooking, which is one of the six, changes the item itself, since it happened biyad hegdish, when you redeem it, even if you cook it again, it will never become nitbal. But over here, it might be different. Why might it be different? Because since after you redeemed it, prior to you doing your final cooking or your final other bringing it home, you'd laid it out to dry, that undid the gemar malach. Now, lemafreya, it's clear that it never had gemar malacha, which means that when it was cooked, biyat hegdish, what was cooked an item that didn't have gemar malacha? When are we going to say that if the echad mishisha devarim happened biyad hegdish, it will be so potent that it will never allow this item to become established, only if what happened biyad hegdish was an act of kavius? Was the cooking biyad hegdish an act of kavius? That's already a bigger argument. That has to do whether the echad, the cooking, which is one of the shisha devarim, will be effective even for an item shaloi nigman malachli. That's what the Gemara says. The Gemara says, for this, it depends. In teimar ha'ur toivel, if you're going to tell me, ur is the way our Gemara, we said that word yesterday, that Rambam writes eish, the Gemara uses the words fire. It means cooking. And cooking is much broader than our Mishnah's example of shalika, which is all the same. If shalika, if eish, if ur is toivel even for unprocessed foods. So now we're going to say the fire that happened to these grapes while they belong to Hegdish will be so powerful that it will disallow these grapes to ever become established from Maisres. But the in Tamar, in the bigger question, that ein ho'ur toivel has nothing to do with Hegdish. That Eish cannot establish a kvius if the item itself wasn't finished yet. Vadai, this is a chiddush. When it belonged to the Hegdish, no one was planning to eat it raisins. You know something of it, when it belongs to Hegdish, no one is allowed to eat it, period. Hegdish is going to sell it. Hegdish is selling it the way it is. But this is also something that we learned many dafim ago, that the buyer will establish what the item is. Since the buyer, the one who redeemed it, that's the buyer here, he laid it out to dry, so his usage of these items show that it was never gemar malachet, because this is raisins. What happened was, it was cooked as grapes. So it's really just about whether shalika is going to be koiveya ledavar shaloi nigman malachta. Depending on that, we're going to come back and resolve this inquiry. So what we did resolve is that whenever you did a maisa beguf, which would be not just fire, it's fire, maybe truma. I was thinking yesterday when I was preparing this, I don't know if you say truma was a maisa bechevtza. You are separating it, but you're not changing it. I don't see why truma should be different than the pnei bayis. But if you were moilach it, okay, or you melacht it, these are things that you actually affected a change in it. Here we're going to say that if it happened biyat hegdish, even after it's redeemed, even though the guy now did another from the shisha devarim, it's not going to affect it with one exception. According to Reish Lakish, if re'iyas b'nei bias, because a action that's only koiveya midrabanan cannot exempt it if later you did an action which is koiveya it midoirais. Gewaltig. Okay. Weiter. Rabbi Yirmiyah boy. Tignoi basode mahu. In other words, we're learning about echad mishisha devarim aviv is cooking it. Cooking it doesn't have to mean only cooking it. I mean, in cooking it, there are many different ways of cooking. One way of cooking is putting something in a thin pot, and that's called frying it in a pan. Like, why would you think that that would be different? That should be cooking. But he's asking, if you fried something in the field, something that you plan to take home, is that koiveya it? So the Gemara doesn't understand what Rabbi Yirmiyah is asking. The Gemara is asking on his inquiry, didn't we just say that fire is one of the shisha devarim? So the Gemara now is going to say something that we are familiar with in the sugya of bishul akum. Do you know, one of the three exemptions of bishul akum is that if you have food that you would have been able to consume it as it is raw, that's one of the three big rules. Even if it was completely cooked by a goy, mitchilasi va'at a yid is allowed to consume it. It's not usher under the rabbinic ban of eating bishul akum. That's the Gemara's explanation. Rabbi Yirmiyah was wondering about a food that could have been eaten raw. You went ahead and you cooked it. Because he's asking on this of the shisha devarim, eish. Is it only on a food item that needs to be cooked? Now that you cooked it, you were machshav it. Or is it even on an item that doesn't need to be cooked? That's what he answered. Ilu efshar deloy meitan gabe mishach boya hava. The inquiry is about something that did not need to be fried, which means it was edible without frying it. Really, it also means edible without cooking it. You know what? He's taka asking a general question. If we were to compare to bishul akum, then we would say that such a cooking it, such a frying it, should not be a koiveya it. But maybe not. Maybe not. Maybe even though it could have been eaten raw, it's just the very fact that you went ahead and you brought it to where you want to bring it, you cooked it, you were machshav it, unanswered. Whole time, we're not even trying to answer questions in the Yerushalmi. The purpose is not to answer, which is very important. That's a big difference between Bechal, Gemara, and Halacha. We're not looking, and what do I do? That's not the point. Here, the point is we're trying to understand. When it comes to trying to understand, it's much better not to know than to know. Much better. Next. Rabbi Yossi b'shem Kahana, in the name of Rabbi Yoino, he quoted the Braisa, Toni Rabbi Chalafta ben Shaul, that what? Osa hesiv basode toivel. Okay. Now, again, the way we will learn our Gemara, it's amazing how Rabbi Yechanan put it together. According to the way we are learning, it's going to be a whole different topic now. Right? We began already last chapter, we began this Pedic, it's about the Echad Meshisha Devarim. Stop and take a step back. What's my step back? And I mentioned this in the words of introduction. Even before Gemar Melacha, my friends, even before Gemar Melacha, one is not allowed to have a Su'udas Keva. That's what the Gemara is talking about. The Gemara is beginning with the premise that how does one define a formal meal versus a snack? Many ways, that's for sure, many ways. One of the ways that we define the Su'udah as a Su'udas Keva is if it's being consumed while reclining, as we know from the night of the Seder. And it makes so much sense. Like when you're eating and you're walking, even if you eat the whole box, you were snacking. When you sit down, and in those days, sitting down and you recline, that makes your consumption to be viewed as a formal consumption. So Asa Hesiv Basada the Braisa says that if you are in the field, and I'm going to emphasize, that would even mean if you're having produce before the Gemar Melacha. If you take from that food and you sit down in a way that you recline, then Toivel would mean Two things. First of all, you were not allowed to do it. You were not allowed to do it. Why not? Because you're not allowed to eat something, achilas keva. But now he's saying something else. If you violated and you did it, it is connected to the sugya. Now that established it lamaisers. Going forward, you can't even snack from it. The shenayim of that food now, well, this was already part of a meal. It already became asur. Now you can't even snack. But but clearly, if you did not eat through a reclining, then einoi toivel. So the Gemara wants to add another nuance. That what are we talking about? The Braisa didn't say. The Braisa spoke about anything. One of the things that one might have consumed in the field would be wine. When you're talking about, you are in a vineyard and you have over there a wine press, and people would recline when they would have these wine drinking sessions. We learned so much about this in Masechta Brachas. So the Gemara wants to add that if what is being consumed is wine, ein hu hesef shu toivel, kol hesef sheyesh bo yayin. Wow. Has to be wine. Has to be wine, which means that if you're sitting together and you're having potatoes, behesef, but there's no yayin, that's not called sudas keva. Love it. Part of what's needed to make the baraisa, you sat down and you made a hesef, and now from now on you b'chlal can't even snack. That's if you were mesev and there was wine. Gemara wants to know if katsav lehesev, what happens if people gathered and they put the food over there, a picnic on the blanket or on a table, and they reclined, or they were going to recline, but they didn't end up doing it. Do we say that the food that was prepped for that eating has mana milsa? These are the words in the Bavli, or not? The Gemara doesn't know. There's a logic to say that since you designated these foods for a reclining meal, even though you never ended up doing it, from now on, those foods cannot be eaten even as a snack. Question, unresolved. Next, Tani, we learned in a Braisa. This is again going to be about Gemar Melacha. And let me add another way of making this simpler. It doesn't have to be this way, but it's going to make it simpler. When do we need Echad Mishisha Devarim Aviv? Only when you plan to take it home. Let's keep on reminding ourselves. When you make a Gemar Melacha in the field and the items are being sold, that's your plan. So we had this in the Mishnah. Then you may not snack after the Gemar Melacha. In other words, there are certain scenarios where the Gemar Melacha itself is koiveya it lamaisres. Let's learn this way in the Braisa, because we're going to have a certain teaching regarding what is the Gemar Melacha, and we'll see that in this Braisa, the moment that has Gemar Melacha, you can't even snack. How can that be? Because you plan to merchandise. Tani, we learned in the Braisa. These items, shum is garlic, shachalayim is kres, chardal is mustard. These are items that were commonly crushed into a utensil that prior had oil. I know this by oil. You go to these fancy restaurants, they give you a plate with olive oil in it, a garlic. Only thing is that there they don't crush it for you. In those days, they would crush it for you. So the act of taking a garlic and crushing it into a container that has oil, that is a bona fide gemar melacha. Versus crushing garlic or shachalayim or chardal not into olive oil. Then it's only powder. That's not yet gemar melachet. And again, let's learn pshat in our braisa that since we're speaking about items that you plan to merchandise, so the gemar melacha is the end of it all. It becomes established lemaisres by the gemar melacha. So the braisa is telling you that the moment you crushed it into a keli that has olive oil, nitbulu, which would mean from now you can't even snack from it because it had a gemar melacha.
But for merchandise, we were establishing that it's by packaging is gemar melacha. No,
so that's another chiddush. When do we have to have packaging? Oh, let's say that shum should be a bundle. If you are gathering many garlics and you're selling them as they are naturally grown prior to the packaging, there's no gemar melacha. But if you go ahead and you take one garlic, you don't package it, but you crush it into a keli of oil, that's the chiddush of this brayso. That will also be a gemar melacha. Now I want to know what will be the status of the oil. I want to know even better. Was this oil tithed or not? So the Gemara has a gavaldik addition. At Kedoin, the Baraisa that we read was speaking about garlic of Tevel. And once we have the Gemar Malacha, in the case where you're selling it, you can't even snack. But the oil was never a problem to begin with. We'll see in a moment why the Gemara is saying that. In other words, whenever you have garlics crushed into oil, just to know how to word it, the garlic is the primary food. The oil is viewed as the secondary. We are trying to know when does the primary have its Gemar Malacha. We say, because since when people crush it into olive oil, now it becomes mamish an edible item, nitbalu. However, says the Gemara, what would happen if the garlic is chulin garlic? The garlic bachlal doesn't have to be tithed. It was already tithed. You have oil that's tevel. Now, let me go back, Aviv. When does the oil become hukva'u? So we learned oil becomes hukva'u when it falls into the bottom part of the Beis Habad, because once it's sitting there, it becomes more refined. The oil that we're talking about over here is that it didn't go into that final holding boil yet. So the oil in itself, the oil is not Gemar Melachet. Someone took that oil and they took a garlic of chulin and they crushed it and they put it into the oil. What's the question right now? What's the two sides? Maybe, again, the final product is garlic pressed into oil. Will that affect a Gemar Melach in the oil? Now, if we're looking at the garlic vadai, that's the whole vart of the Braisa, tane, that the garlic that's crushed into oil, the garlic, now that's the Gemar Melach. But what happens if the issue b'chlal is not the garlic? The issue is the oil. Now, don't forget, the oil is secondary to the garlic. Secondary to the garlic. It's like ketchup is secondary to your steak, you Americans. For kids, the ikid is the ketchup. That's the main food. The French fries is to eat more ketchup. But it's not the emes. The oil is secondary. So will we say that the oil that's secondary, will it have a Gemar Malacha because the garlic was put into it? Or maybe not. Maybe this Braisa cannot apply when we are judging the secondary item, which is the oil. You get that? That's great. Again, the question remains unresolved. Next. Says the Gemara, Rab Ze'eda, in the name of Rab Chia bar Ashi, b'shem Rav, Eshkol shesechotoy lekois, when you squeeze a cluster of grapes directly into a cup, normally, when does wine, aviv, have Gemar Melacha when you skim the sediment off the top? Here you skim nothing off nothing. You squeeze it directly into a cup. So why should it be an issue? Because su'udas keva may not be eaten even on a item shaloi nigman malachte. That's what I spoke in the intro. And the Gemara is telling you now, again, we're going to look at how do you define su'udas keva? When it comes to wine consumed out of a cup is su'udas keva. How great is that? I want you to know, just on the side, you have to make kiddush with makam su'uda. And for sure, you should have chal on the table or mezoinus on the table. But what happens if you don't have? And you have to have a kiddush with makam su'uda. If not, your kiddush is not valid. One of the b'di'evet solutions will be to have another cup of wine. This is the concept that wine, but that's wine in a cup. The very fact that you squeeze the cluster of grapes directly into a cup, that renders drinking it as a su'udas keva. So, and even though aviv, there isn't a gemar malacha, and you're not going to merchandise it, so you don't even have the shisha devarim. Doesn't matter. You cannot have su'udas keva on tevel, even bedavar shaloi nigman malachli. That's what the Gemara is telling you.
Fine, if it's like walking and drinking it, would that be?
Doesn't matter if you're walking even. No, it's before we were speaking about a meal on potatoes that you were reclining. The Gemara added, for that to be viewed as a chilas keva, you have to add wine. But if you're drinking wine out of a cup is called something kavua. That's how chashuv wine is. That's how chashuv wine is. But that's only if you put the wine in the cup. But if you put the wine in a tamchoy, Clearly, guys, here again, it's like before the garlic and the oil. You're putting it into a platter of food. The whole wine is subservient to the food. You're adding flavor to the plate. So over there, loy nitmal. And now, guys, that tamchoy, you cannot have su'udas keva on that tamchoy. I got that. That's on anything.
If you're
But
walking in, drinking wine, that doesn't count.
That's what Aviv just asked. It sounds from our Gemara. It sounds from our Gemara that even if you're walking, if you're drinking wine out of a cup, that's called you're having a su'udas keva. I wonder what the halacha says about coffee.
That's good at wine.
Okay. The end of the Mishnah is that hamekape latavshel pater. The Mishnah was speaking about wine that was not skimmed. You put it into a pot. The pot has in it cooked food. You skimmed it off the top of the pot. The Gemara says that pater. How did we learn pshat in the Mishnah? We learned pshat in the Mishnah that our Mishnah is following the rule that if you don't yet have gemar melacha, the shisha devarim will not be koiveya it lamaisris. Even though you skimmed it, that's not the way you skim wine. You skim wine when the wine is pure. Once you put wine into the food, we said some of the shumanim adhere to the food. So that skimming doesn't do anything. There's no gemar melacha. Now, the problem is that forget about the skimming. You put it into a tafshel. A tafshel is normally understood as a cooked pot of food. We are presuming now that the food is still very hot. Now, I want to know, Eish, we just mentioned this. Does Eish establish a kvius even when there's no gemar melacha? Really, that's debatable. But let's add what the achronim add over here, that when you put wine into a tafshil, don't forget, you're not drinking pure wine. When I drink pure wine, Aviv, I don't want it to have sediment. When I'm putting wine into the tafshil, the fact that I put it into the tafshil, this Gemara is going on the logic, no gemar melacha is needed. This in itself should be its gemar melacha. I'm consuming it. And it's hot. So I have gemar melacha because I plan to eat it as is. And there's fire. So there should be a kvius lamaisris. That's the Gemara's kasha. And because of that, the Gemara says, you're right, our Mishnah is only speaking about a tafshel that's cold. The reason why the wine remains permitted is because there is no eish. But if you put it like a data, if you put it into a pot, so the Mishnah says you're chayiv if you skim it off the pot. And why is that? This is something that we learned when we learned the Mishnah. Amar Abu Lazar, That means when I put wine into a pot and the pot is empty, so then if now I skim the sediment that rises to the top, that's a bona fide act of gemar melacha. And that's what the Mishnah, Amar Abu Lazar, we said this when we learned the Mishnah, that when does the Mishnah say that if you skim it in the pot, if you skim it into the cooked pot, into the food pot, then it's nothing. If you skim it from the kedera reikones himasnisa, which is why that's considered a bona fide gemar melacha. And indeed, says the Gemara, the Flamed Dalid, that masnisa, we have to go with this girsa. Amrachein, our Mishnah must be understood that way. The Mishnah just said hamekape latavshel pater, that if you skim wine after it was put into a tafshil, we said it could be cold, but it's a pot with food, your pater. Then the Mishnah says when you skim it off a kedera, it's chayiv. The Mishnah never said the words empty. But the Mishnah gave a logic. The Mishnah says, what's the bird cotton? That when we learned before, what is the gemar melacha by wine? And we said that when the wine falls into the boid under the wine press and you skim it from the top of it, that's the gemar melacha. So our Mishnah is saying a pot has a much smaller base kibble than the big vat in the wine press. So what? Big, small, it's the same idea. You're having wine sit in a utensil, you're skimming the sediment off the top, you're making it refined. Now the wine is already product to be consumed. The fact that the Mishnah says when pnei sheikol cotton must mean that the pot is empty. Why? Because if the pot is full of food, then it has nothing to do with the bird cotton. So from the logic of the Mishnah, we taka see that will be the logic. Now again, it's very interesting. When you skim it off the top of an empty pot, Rabbi Mendel, all that is gemar melacha. There is no kivius yet. Make no mistake. If the Mishnah is saying chayiv, it must mean, that's what we said when we learned the Mishnah, that you're planning to merchandise it. So when the Gemara was asking before that A should be kaveh, it's a little nuanced. The Gemara is saying that even if you don't plan to merchandise it, that was the Gemara's kasha. Even though there's no Gemar Melacha, if there's no Gemar Melacha, A should not be effective, or it is a machloikas. The Gemara held that when you put it into a tamchoy, that means when I put wine into a pot of food, this wine is considered Gemar Melachet. Because I am planning to eat it as is. Don't forget, wine is not the primary. When the wine is the primary item, I want it to be refined. When I put wine, I think even when people cook today, I don't think they put the expensive wines in the food.
No.
You don't need to do that. You can put wine in with sediment. So what? That was the Gemara's kash. So the Gemara basically said, you're right. Putting it into food means it has a Gemar Malacha, but there's no Eish. Because the case of the Mishnah is that the food is cold. Amazing. Chavra Atkan, God willing to be continued.